Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. I'd love to chat today about a topic that's very relevant here in Israel, that of military conscription, but specifically how armies like the IDF, which is one of the most impressive militaries in the world, manage to run militaries in which you have a standing army, a permanently employed group of soldiers that are needed to maintain the operational backbone of the army, and then you have reservists who are periodically patched in and called up. It's a very personal subject in Israel for many who are, probably everybody has a family serving in reserves or has a friend who's called up to the army periodically, and Israel has a conscription period for men and for women. But I've always been curious as to how large the actual standing army is in the IDF, and whether it's something that's been there from the very beginning. I think it has, right? But what's the actual size of it? I ask because reading in today's news that the IDF is making some changes to reserve battalion command. I'm just reading a headline from Ynet from a few days ago. IDF says cutting back superfluous reservists will reduce duty time. So in a situation like this, where you have different degrees of readiness and training, you have maybe a professional army that's their career soldiers, and then you have troops and battalions that are brought in but integrated into one fighting force during wartime. So my question is how that works on a operational level, and not just here in Israel but in different militaries around the world, because it seems like a sort of unusual situation in any context, whether military or otherwise, that you have a group of full-time people working in an organization. You have institutional knowledge that's built up in that organization, but then you have to slot in periodically not just a small amount but a vast amount of manpower, woman power into the army periodically. So I'd love to understand what kind of implications that has for training, information sharing, information compartmentalization that we often talk about. Would you say it's fair to assume that some compartmentalization has to be instituted that the standing army can't always share with the reservist infrastructure that gets pulled up? So again, not just looking here at Israel. Israel is a particularly pertinent example, but other militaries around the world where you have this merged model of standing and reserve armies. How does it work exactly, and how do they work side by side when wartime occurs? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I'm sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother. It is February 12th, 2026, and the city is finally starting to feel like it is breathing again after a very long winter.
Herman and Poppleberry at your service. It is a bit of a gray morning here today, isn't it? The mist is still hanging over the valley toward the Neset, but it makes for a perfect atmosphere to dive into some heavy-duty organizational theory.
It does. The coffee is strong, and the prompts are getting even stronger. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice note this morning that hits very close to home for anyone living in this part of the world, especially given the massive shifts we have seen in military doctrine over the last 2 years. He wants to talk about military conscription. Specifically, the model used by the Israel Defense Forces, or the IDF.
It is a fascinating topic, especially from an organizational and technical perspective. Daniel was asking about how you bridge that gap between a professional standing army and a massive force of reservists who are civilians 90% of the time. He is curious about the how, the nuts and bolts of making a hybrid system like this actually function without collapsing under its own weight.
Right, because if you think about it, most Fortune 500 companies struggle to onboard a single new employee over the course of a month. They have orientation, IT setup, and weeks of getting up to speed. Here, you have a system that needs to onboard hundreds of thousands of people into high-stakes life-and-death roles in under 48 hours. The operational complexity of that is staggering. We saw it in October 2023, and we have seen the iterations of that system ever since.
It really is. And Daniel specifically pointed out a recent headline from earlier this week about the IDF looking to cut back on what they called superfluous reservists to reduce the burden of duty time. That suggests a major shift in how they view the efficiency of this model as we move into the mid-20s. It is no longer just about having the most bodies. It is about having the right bodies at the right time.
So, let's dive into this. Herman, you have been digging into the research on military structures and the recent 2025 defense white papers. For our listeners who might not be as familiar with the Israeli model, how is it actually built? Because it is not just a professional army with a few volunteers on the side.
Exactly. It is often described as a tripartite structure, a three-part system. At the center, you have the professional corps. These are the career officers and non-commissioned officers who stay in for decades. They are the institutional memory, the ones who maintain the bases and the high-level strategy. Then you have the conscripts, the 18 to 21-year-olds doing their mandatory service. They are the primary labor force, the ones doing the daily patrols and manning the systems. But the real strategic depth, the muscle of the country, comes from the third tier, the reserves, or miluim. In Israel, once you finish your mandatory service, you are assigned to a reserve unit, and you can be called up for weeks at a time every year until you are in your 40s, or even older for certain specialized roles.
And that is where the friction Daniel mentioned comes in. You have people who are surgeons, software engineers, or teachers, and suddenly they are tank commanders or intelligence analysts. How do you keep those skills from degrading when they spend 11 months of the year thinking about JavaScript or classroom management?
That is the big challenge. The military refers to this as maintaining readiness. On an operational level, it relies on a concept called the organic unit. This is crucial. Most reservists serve in the same unit they were in during their conscript years, or at least with the same group of people for years on end. They don't just join a random pool, they join a family. They train together once or twice a year in what is called miluim. This creates a level of social cohesion that you just do not see in professional armies like the United States, where people move around between different bases every few years. In the IDF reserves, you know exactly who is to your left and who is to your right because you have known them since you were 19.
So the social bond acts as a sort of glue for the technical skills? If I haven't touched a radio in a year, my buddy who has been playing with electronics in his garage can remind me how it works?
Absolutely. When things go south and a war starts, you are not just fighting next to a stranger, you are fighting next to the guy who was at your wedding. But there is also a massive technological infrastructure behind this that has been upgraded significantly in the last 3 years. They use advanced digital command and control systems, specifically the Zaid system, or the Digital Land Army, to ensure that when a reservist walks into a command center, the interface and the data are consistent with what they practiced. The goal is to make the transition from civilian to soldier feel like logging into a familiar operating system.
I want to push on that information sharing piece that Daniel asked about. If I am a civilian 330 days a year, how does the military handle compartmentalization? You cannot just give every reservist access to the most sensitive state secrets while they are sitting in a coffee shop in Tel Aviv or working at a tech hub in Haifa.
This is one of the most sophisticated parts of the system, and it has become even more robust since the cybersecurity scares of 2024. Information security, or Bitacon Sadeh, is drilled into soldiers from day one. But more importantly, the access is ephemeral. In a modern military like the IDF, intelligence is highly digitized and role-based. When a reservist is called up via an Order 8, that is the Emergency Mobilization Notice, their security clearance is activated in real time. It is linked to their biometric ID and their specific unit assignment. They have access to what they need for their specific mission, but that access is revoked the moment they sign out of duty. It is essentially just-in-time intelligence.
But what about the institutional knowledge? If you have a professional officer who has been tracking a specific threat for 5 years, and then a reservist comes in to lead a battalion against that threat, there is a massive information asymmetry there. The reservist is essentially a guest star in a long-running drama.
You are hitting on a really important point, Corn. This is where the side-by-side integration becomes critical. In a wartime scenario, you rarely have a unit that is 100% reservists without any connection to the standing army. You have liaison officers, you have professional staff who provide the current intelligence brief. The reservists bring the mass and the specialized civilian skills, like a reservist who is a data scientist in real life helping to optimize a logistics route. But the standing army provides the real-time context. It is a plug-and-play architecture. The professional core provides the motherboard, and the reservists are the modules that provide the processing power.
It sounds like a massive version of a gig economy platform, but for national defense. You have a pool of verified talent that you can activate on demand. But Daniel mentioned the news about cutting back on superfluous reservists. Why now? If the model works, why change it? We are in 2026. Shouldn't they want more people, not fewer?
Well, the nature of warfare has changed drastically since the conflict in 2023 and 2024. In the past, you needed sheer numbers, boots on the ground to hold territory. Today, warfare is increasingly defined by precision, autonomous systems, and cyber capabilities. Having 50,000 extra people who are not specialized in those areas might actually be a liability. They cost money, they require massive logistics, food, water, transport, and they take away from the national economy. The IDF is realizing that they need to be leaner. They are moving toward a smart reserve model. They want the elite cyber analyst and the heavy tank mechanic, but they might not need the person whose job can now be done by an automated border sensor or a drone swarm.
That makes sense. If you have a reservist who is just sitting around guarding a fence, you are losing their economic output as a civilian. Maybe they are a high-end architect, and you are paying for their upkeep as a soldier. It is a double loss for the state. But let's talk about the human element. Daniel mentioned that everyone here knows someone in the reserves. How does that affect the transition when wartime occurs? It isn't just a logistical shift. It is a psychological one.
It is a psychological gear shift that is hard to explain to people who haven't seen it. You see it in the traffic. Suddenly, the highways are full of cars heading south toward Gaza or north toward the Galilee, driven by people in half uniforms, with their civilian bags in the back and their rifles on the passenger seat. There is a sense of collective purpose that overrides the individual. But from an operational standpoint, it creates a unique challenge, the inversion of hierarchy.
Oh, I love this part. Tell them about the CEO and the corporal. This is the part that always blows people's minds in the States.
Right. This is a classic Israeli military trope, but it is absolutely true. You might have a high-flying chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar tech company who, in his reserve unit, is a simple sergeant or a driver. And his commanding officer might be a 24-year-old student who works as a waiter during the week. In the reserves, the civilian status is checked at the door. But, and this is the key, the Army is smart enough to leverage those civilian skills informally. If that sergeant is an expert in logistics or AI, the young commander is going to listen to him when they are planning a move. It is a much flatter hierarchy than almost any other military in the world. It is meritocracy by necessity.
That flatness must help with the information sharing Daniel was curious about. If people feel comfortable speaking up regardless of rank, the best ideas rise to the top faster. But it also sounds like it could be chaotic. How do you maintain discipline when everyone thinks they are the boss because they have a PhD or a corner office in Tel Aviv?
It is a controlled chaos. The discipline comes from mutual respect and the high stakes. But you are right, it does not look like the British Army or the United States Marines. There is less saluting and more arguing. But that arguing is often how they solve complex problems under pressure. It is a culture of questioning, which actually serves the compartmentalization goals too. People are trained to ask, why do I need to know this? Or, why are we doing it this way? This constructive defiance is actually a defense mechanism against bad intelligence or poor planning.
Let's look at the global context. Daniel asked about other militaries. Does anyone else do it like this? I know Switzerland has a big reserve system, and we often hear about the citizen soldier model there.
Switzerland is the other famous example. Every Swiss man is a soldier and keeps his gear at home, but the difference is the level of active engagement. The Swiss haven't fought a major war in centuries. Their system is about deterrence and civil defense. The Israeli system is battle-hardened. It is constantly being tested. Singapore also has a very similar model, which they actually based on the Israeli model back in the 1960s. They call it the total defense strategy. They realized as a small island nation, they could never have a standing army big enough to defend themselves against larger neighbors, so they turned the entire population into a latent military force. Finland is another one to watch. They have a massive reserve because of their long border with Russia, and they have been integrating more Israeli-style digital mobilization tech lately.
It is interesting that these small, high-tech nations, Israel, Singapore, Switzerland, Finland, all landed on the same solution. It is almost like a hardware-software split. The standing army is the hardware, the infrastructure that is always on. The reservists are the software applications that you load when you need to perform a specific task. If you need Cyber Defense version 2.0, you call up the guys from the Herzliya Tech Park.
That is a great analogy, and just like software, if you do not update it, it becomes buggy. That is why the training is so important. One of the things that people often get wrong about the IDF is they think the reserves are just a backup. In reality, in a full-scale conflict, the reserves make up about 70 to 80% of the total fighting force. The standing army is really just there to hold the line for the first 24 to 48 hours while the reserves mobilize. If the reserves don't show up or if they aren't ready, the system fails.
So if the mobilization fails, the country is essentially defenseless. That is an incredible amount of pressure on the logistics and information systems. Think about the data. You have to track the location, health, and equipment of hundreds of thousands of people who are constantly moving, changing jobs, and traveling abroad.
And their specialized skills. The Army maintains a database that is essentially a more detailed, classified version of LinkedIn. They know if you have picked up a new certification in cybersecurity or if you have become a licensed heavy machinery operator in your civilian life. When a specific need arises, say they need someone who speaks a rare dialect or understands a specific type of structural engineering for a tunnel operation, they can query that database and find a reservist who fits the bill. In 2026, this is all powered by AI matching algorithms that can identify the best human assets for a mission in seconds.
This brings me back to Daniel's question about side-by-side operations. When wartime occurs, and these two groups merge, what is the biggest point of failure? Is it the tech, or is it the culture?
Usually, it is the delta in technology and currency. The standing army always gets the newest toys first. They have the latest radios, the latest night vision, the latest digital maps. When the reservists show up, they are often using equipment that is 5 or 10 years old. Integrating those two generations of technology in real time is a nightmare for the Signal Corps. They have to ensure that the old radios can still talk to the new encrypted networks. If they can't, you get friendly fire, incidents, or missed objectives.
I imagine that is where the information sharing gets tricky. If the standing army is seeing a high-resolution drone feed on their tablets, and the reservists are looking at a paper map or an older digital system, they are literally seeing two different versions of the battlefield.
Exactly, and that is where misconceptions happen. There is a widespread assumption that a soldier is a soldier, but the gap in situational awareness can be huge. The IDF has been working on a project called Torch 750, an evolution of the Zaid system, to bridge this. It is a unified command and control system that is supposed to be ubiquitous across all units, whether they are regular or reserve. The goal is to give everyone the same Blue Force tracking, which shows where all friendly units are, and the same enemy target data. It is about creating a single source of truth.
It is basically a real-time strategy game interface for real life.
Pretty much. But think about the security implications of that. If a reservist loses their tablet or it gets captured, you have just handed the enemy a window into your entire tactical network. That is where the ephemeral access we talked about earlier comes back in. The system has to be able to remotely wipe data or limit the view based on the specific GPS location of that unit. If you aren't in the hot zone, you don't see the hot data.
It is a constant cat-and-mouse game between usability and security. I want to go back to what Daniel mentioned about the IDF cutting back on superfluous reservists. This was from an article on Ynet recently. It seems to suggest that the Army is moving toward a more professionalized model. Do you think we are seeing the end of the People's Army concept?
I don't think it is the end, but it is definitely an evolution. The term People's Army, or Zavaham, is a sacred cow in Israeli politics. It is the idea that everyone serves and the military is the great melting pot of society. But the reality of modern warfare in 2026 is that a single elite cyber analyst or a drone operator is worth more than 100 poorly trained infantrymen in many scenarios. The army is trying to find a balance. They want to keep the social cohesion of the universal draft, but they want to stop wasting the time of people whose roles aren't critical. They are moving toward a differential service model. Some people serve longer and more intensely, while others do a shorter, more civilian defense-oriented service.
It is also an economic necessity. In 2026, the cost of living and the complexity of the economy mean that taking a person away from their job for a month every year is a huge drain on the GDP. If you are doing that to someone who is just filing papers in a warehouse, the math doesn't add up. The state is paying their full salary through the National Insurance Institute, but they aren't getting a military return on that investment.
And there is a political angle too. There are large segments of the population that do not serve for various reasons, and that creates massive social tension, the equality and burden or Shivyan Banatel debate. By making the reserve service more efficient and targeted, the government can argue they are reducing the burden on those who do serve, while also professionalizing the force. It is a way to modernize the military without completely abandoning the citizen-soldier identity that is so central to the country's DNA.
So, what are the practical takeaways here? If you are running an organization, maybe not a military, but a large company or a government agency, what can you learn from this standing plus reserve model?
The first takeaway is the value of latent capacity. Most organizations are built for 95% capacity. When a crisis hits, they have no room to grow. The Israeli military model is built for 10% capacity in peacetime, with the ability to scale to 100% in 48 hours. That requires a massive investment in standardized processes and documentation. You cannot have a reservist show up and spend a week learning how you file reports. The interface has to be intuitive and universal.
It is like having a really good codebase with excellent documentation. A new developer should be able to clone the repo and make a meaningful contribution on day one.
Exactly. And the second takeaway is the importance of social capital. The reason the reservists can perform so well is because they trust the people they are serving with. They have a shared history. In the corporate world, we often treat people as replaceable cogs. But if you maintain alumni networks or keep former employees on reserve as consultants, you are building a force that already knows your culture and your systems. You aren't starting from zero.
That is a great point. I've seen some tech companies doing this, where they have a pool of former engineers they can call on for specific projects or during a crunch. It is much more efficient than hiring a brand new contractor who doesn't know where the servers are kept.
And the third takeaway is about information compartmentalization. The military's use of ephemeral, role-based access is something every high-security organization should be doing. You don't give the keys to the castle to everyone, you give them the key to the specific room they are working in, and you change the lock when they leave. In a world of constant cyber threats, just in time, access is the only way to stay secure.
It is funny how these military concepts translate so directly to cybersecurity and organizational management. Daniel's prompt really opened up a lot of layers here. It is not just about soldiers, it is about how you manage human potential at scale. It is about how you keep a society ready for the worst-case scenario without destroying its best-case economic potential.
It really is. And it is about the trade-offs we make as a society. Here in Israel, the trade-off is a high level of security and social cohesion in exchange for a massive personal and economic burden on the individual. Whether that trade-off remains sustainable in the long term, especially with the technological shifts and the social divisions we are seeing in 2026, is the big question. The superfluous reservist headline is just the tip of the iceberg.
I think we are going to see more of this hybrid model globally, not less. As crises become more frequent, whether they are climate-related, pandemics, or cyber attacks, governments are going to need a way to surge their capabilities without keeping a massive, expensive standing bureaucracy. They need a reserve force for everything.
I agree. The gig economy is coming for national service. It might not be conscription in the traditional sense, but a voluntary, tech-enabled reserve force for all kinds of national emergencies. Imagine a reserve cyber corps or a reserve medical surge that functions with the same precision as the IDF reserves.
Well, Herman, I think we have thoroughly explored the depths of this one. It is a complex, often emotional topic, but the operational side of it is truly a marvel of engineering and social planning. It is the ultimate weird prompt, because it forces us to look at the machinery of a nation.
It really does. And I hope this gave Daniel and our listeners a better sense of what is actually happening behind those headlines. It is not just about calling people up. It is about the invisible digital and social threads that hold the whole thing together. It is about the Zaid system, the Order 8 notifications, and the sergeant who is actually a CEO.
Before we wrap up, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been listening. We've been doing My Weird Prompts for a long time now. 574 episodes to be exact, and we wouldn't be here without your curiosity.
If you're enjoying the show, we would really appreciate a quick review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us, and we love reading your feedback. It keeps us motivated to keep digging into these rabbit holes.
You can find all our past episodes and a way to get in touch with us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. We love hearing your prompts, so keep them coming.
And thanks again to our housemate Daniel for sending in this prompt. It gave us a lot to think about over breakfast, and I think I need another cup of coffee before I start my own civilian workday.
Definitely. All right, I think that is a wrap for today. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will see you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay curious.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.